What's going on, y'all? I'm KM Best. You might know me from playing hyper-optimized decks at the top end of Infinite. Now, there are a lot of things that high Infinite gamers are, but one thing they are not is always super hyper-optimized. I don't get a chance to show that side of high Infinite very often, so I wanted to make a video highlighting some of the weird, off-brand, but still powerful decks that I sometimes lose to at the top end of ladder. I hope that this can be helpful in showing people that it's not always just people playing the best stuff at the top end. There's a lot of creativity and experimentation and trying to find new angles on the game. So let's take a look at 6 of the weirdest decks that have beaten my ass. I don't think it would be fair to start anywhere but the combo. Now, I know if people are regulars in my stream or in several other streams, you will have heard about the combo at this point. It arose on a Discord call, and for those who are unaware, the eponymous combo here is playing Blink with M'Baku. The idea here is you blink M'Baku into a Blue Marvel or an Onslaught on the final turn of the game, and that is an extremely powerful thing to do. Now, getting the M'Baku back out in a deck that is very often looking to fill the board can be very, very rewarding. You can even use this to play around something like Killmonger. It is at its best when it is unexpected, and this is unfortunately a fairly expected deck right now. The person who came up with this deck was Butt. You may recognize him from previous interviews on this channel or from generally playing incredibly weird stuff in the top end of Infinite. And I think a lot of people tried it and then sort of fell off of it, but I'm here to let you know that he climbed back into the top 20 with this deck. It is an actual legitimate strategy in as much as any legitimate strategy can involve playing the card M'Baku. The way this deck works is instead of doing Gilgamesh type stuff, you're looking to go wider. Gilgamesh is very good at giving Zoo the ability to go very tall, as is Cull Obsidian. But one thing this deck can do is Khazar Blue Marvel Onslaught, especially if that Onslaught actually only costs 1 and is named M'Baku. When you are doing something that is so sort of Onslaught heavy, one lane heavy, the power of something like M'Baku is actually magnified, not just in the literal sense of, oh, it's going to be a bigger M'Baku because you have like Blue Marvel Onslaught or Khazar Onslaught or something like that, in the slightly less literal sense of, oh, well, you're really filling up this one lane and you might actually need that power to win another lane, and it will be a meaningful amount of power if you are doing what we're talking about here. This is a deck that is a bit on rails and is a bit draw dependent. Like many Blink decks, if you draw the wrong half of the deck, you're going to end up with no good Blink targets. It's definitely an issue. Now, when you compare this deck to its other general competitor, you're comparing it to Gilgamesh Zoo. So it's worth talking about what you gain and what you lose. What you gain is surprise power and onslaught. What you lose is the ability to run a lot of reasonable tech cards. Your turn 5, your turn 6, even your turn 4 is very spoken for. To me, that actually makes the most important card in this deck Shana, because as a 3-drop that spreads as wide as possible, you need that kind of stuff to be happening early because your 4, your 5, your 6 are going to be something that is large, or going to be something that is major. Most of the time in this deck, you're looking at, 4 Khazar, 5 Blue Marvel, 6 M'Baku Blink, or 6 Onslaught on one of those cards. And that means that you're really going to need to have spread across the board early. This, of course, brings us to Kyera, who is fairly critical in a deck like this because of how much you need to have spread across the board early. Kyera does end up mattering a decent amount because of that play pattern. This deck really wants you to go for being a wide board and really does not want to be vulnerable to Killmonger, making Kyera, unfortunately, a very necessary inclusion. And that is kind of your only real tech slot. You aren't going to catch this deck with Shadow Kings. You aren't going to catch this deck with Shang-Chi's. It's just not the thing it really has the ability to run. Next up is Move Clog, pioneered by Big Baby and Stefan, 2 other former guests on this channel. And what this deck is trying to do is combine a powerful Clog game plan with the power of Dagger and Sage and Shadow King and Iron Man. What this deck looks to do is keep your opponents at a fairly minimal level of points with the Clog of Green Goblin and Dagger and White Widow, and then capitalize on the fact that those lanes are full with Dagger and Sage. I realize I said with the Clog of Green Goblin and Dagger and White Widow there. Debris. I meant debris. My apologies. Now, these are this is like actually a fairly straightforward game plan. Like, honestly, this is the kind of thing that makes a lot of sense once you look at it and actually see what's going on. Because really what this is a deck that is saying, I looked at the text of Dagger and I looked at the text of Sage, and I realized that both of them really want you to have a lot of points on the board. So, if I fill up your lanes, I'm going to be able to make you have a lot of units on the board. I said points. I'm really beefing this, aren't I? This is a powerful thing to do. This is just baseline a pretty strong thing to do. One weakness that the deck has is that if you don't have Dagger and Sage, you kind of don't do enough to win 2 lanes. Like, this is a deck that is very good at setting up. You've got your Clogs, you've got your opponent stuck at like maybe 3 or 4 points in one lane, but you need to figure out how to win them. And that can run into the issues of, I didn't draw Dagger, I didn't draw Sage. Suddenly it's a little more difficult for me to win 2 lanes. Do keep in mind just how large Dagger can get in a deck like this. You have multiple move cards. Really, you only need one. Like, she is just 12 power if she moves to a full lane. That is patently ridiculous. And because you are using your Clogs to keep your opponent from really developing anything that's all that big, you are able to just be like, yeah, this Dagger's going to win that lane. There's like a rock there and a White Widow card or something like that. Like, that is a really big deal. Sage is usually the card that wins the lanes that are contested. The way this deck tends to play out, there's usually like a lane that's very easy to win because of the Clog, and then a lane that's a little harder to win because both people are contesting it. Maybe that's the lane you played Debris in, maybe you didn't draw enough of your Clog stuff, but there's usually going to be one lane that's like pretty high leverage in a deck like this, and that is where Sage shines. Sage has the clutch gene. She is a phenomenally powerful card in lanes that both players are contesting. There is no other 3-drop that is going to get as large as her. So her role is sort of dual. You can do like I filled up both of their lanes, and then Sage and Dagger win 2 lanes. One of them wins one lane, and one of them wins the other one. But what's much more commonly happening is you have like a Clog lane that is being won by small guys, and then in the high leverage lane, you have like Sage really holding it down, sometimes Sage and Dagger. This is a powerful deck, and you can see that the inclusion of the Iron Man is for that high leverage lane, because there typically is one lane that will decide which way the game goes to you or your opponent, and Iron Man is very good at winning high leverage lanes. And I think that's sort of a concept you're going to want to understand when you play a deck like this. Like, there's usually going to be one lane that the game swings on, because there's going to be one lane that you are able to fully Clog, and the lane that the game swings on is going to be the lane that you are not able to do that in, because of how your opponents are going to play into it. So, do keep in mind, when you start seeing stuff like this, this is what your opponent is playing. One interesting note here is there is a Polaris in here that I think maybe could be a different card. Polaris is solid in a world of White Widows and Debris and all this sort of awkward Clog stuff, and she does end up being as good here as anything else, but it does sort of occur to me that we lack general other interaction. One of the unfortunate things about playing a Clog deck is it almost precludes Red Guardian, because you are putting so many things, like a White Widow proc is going to make everything in that lane unhittable. A Debris rock is going to make everything in that lane unhittable. And so you end up in this weird spot where it's like, this is a deck that would really want Red Guardian if it wasn't doing the things that it was doing. And so it's playing Polaris because that works with the things that it's doing, but it does end up missing, like, oh, my opponent is playing an ongoing card. I kind of can't do anything about that. So that is this deck in a nutshell. It's a powerful Clog strategy utilizing some underutilized cards. Next up is Yo Woody's attempt at bringing back Moongirl and Quinjet, and as long as you don't get Mobius, this deck is going to output just a generally immense amount of points. What's going on here effectively is you want to play Quinjet Moongirl, and then you want to do the biggest turn 6 of all time. You have Mysterio to make your Mockingbird super cheap. Moongirl cards also make your Mockingbird super cheap. Quinjet makes your copied Moongirl cards even cheaper. And then you just have the biggest and best cheap stat sticks in the game. US Agent is a phenomenally powerful cheap stat stick. Sage is a phenomenally powerful cheap stat stick. And of course, we even have the ability to fit in a card like Nocturne, who kind of just goes everywhere and covers us in matchups against like Limbo gamers and things of that nature. The main thing this deck really wants to do is just play large women, whether those be She-Hulks or Mockingbirds or Sages. This is a deck that is looking to explode in terms of points. One thing that I think this deck really has going for it is in games where you're not a Moongirl Quinjet deck, you actually just kind of play enough good cards that you can do good stuff, right? Like, oh, I didn't draw Moongirl, but I have, Quinjet Valentina 6-drop on 3. Oh, I didn't draw Moongirl, but I have Mysterio Mockingbird. Oh, I didn't draw Moongirl, but I have Sunspot She-Hulk, right? Like, there's just kind of a lot that this deck can do as a good cards deck that other more combo intensive builds find themselves unable to do. And I think that's the thing about this list that impresses me the most, is that it is a deck that looks like a pure combo deck, but really the combo is just sort of glued on there on the back end. And this is a deck that can play totally normal, reasonable games of Marvel Snap and also sometimes be a Quinjet Moongirl combo deck. And I think that's the real appeal here. It's not the greatest deck in the world at being either a combo deck or a mid-range good cards deck, but it can do a reasonable facsimile of both. And I think people really enjoy being able to choose the game plan and the strategy that they want in a specific matchup. Being able to look at this matchup and say, this is not a matchup where I want to be a Moongirl Quinjet deck. Maybe they have a Mobius. You want to be a totally different type of deck. You want to be playing just Nocturne and Mysterio and good cards and like final turn Sage US Agent, and you can compete with that. Now, if you end up in situations where neither of your strategies end up very good, I think one thing that really comes to mind with a deck like this is Silver Surfer, where you're just sort of looking at Silver Surfer and your US Agent does nothing, your Sage is lower value than it would normally be because they're a Brute Abs deck, they have Mobius, like there are some bad matchups for this deck, don't get me wrong, you get your Quinjet Killmonger, like Silver Surfer especially sticks out as like, I don't want to deal with that when I'm playing this deck. And so I think that there are some like positioning things in terms of how the metagame looks at a deck like this that make it more or less appealing. But this deck is genuinely like very close to making a ton of sense. And it's something to keep in mind when you're looking at, oh, it's a different metagame now. What can I be playing? I think this deck is legitimately strong, a genuine deck building feat, and the way it bridges between being just good stats ahead of the curve and I am a combo deck dropping 40 power on the final turn of the game is really impressive to me. I really do enjoy that because when you are able to combo off with, She-Hulk Quinjet, maybe you have a Sunspot on the board, maybe you're getting some Mockingbird value too, you have these like 40 power final turns that are incredibly strong. There are just like a lot of things standing in the way of that, especially in the Silver Surfer deck that kind of make it awkward for me. But this is a very well-constructed, well-put-together, and well-thought-out deck. I think you might be starting to see some sort of pattern here. There's a lot of people who are playing, Valentina, a lot of experimentation with Mockingbird. I think, like, one of the things that top-end players will do a lot of is see a card or, like, a package and then be like, I should do something else with this. This deck by Derek caught my eye. It's a powerful baseline deck, but what it really reminds me of, more than anything else, is No Key. Like, this reminds me a lot of just like, oh, I'm going to play like some cards that just sort of weirdly win games. Like, I have, of course, my Mobius. I have, of course, my Luke Cage. I have my very unfair Mysterio Mockingbird thing. Cersei is a reasonable to great inclusion in any deck playing Mysterio Mockingbird. Like, when Cersei came out, I think one of the things that people said about her, and I'm one of these people, is like, she is an Annihilus card, and she is an Annihilus card. But one interesting note is she also is when we talk about that, we're talking about the package, right? Sentry, Annihilus, Mockingbird, Hood, Mysterio, Cersei, right? Like we're talking about a group of cards. And the interesting thing to me is that you can cut the Annihilus part of that package and say Mysterio, Cersei, Mockingbird is its own package. And that's what's been done here. So this deck to me strikes me as Noki with that package in it. This is a small ball type of mid-rangey deck. It's not going to put the most points on the board, but it has a decent amount of interactive tools. And suddenly you're looking at very cheap Mockingbirds, very powerful Cerseis, the ability to turn your Hood into something that is better than the Hood, the ability to turn your Mysterio clones into things that are better than Mysterio clones. And you end up with this small but powerful deck that I think is just an interesting way to approach deck building at High Infinite right now, where you're just like, I have a core that I'm building around, but the things that I do with that core are very different from normal. We don't need to be an Annihilus deck. We can just take the parts we like and then run tech cards and put power in here and play a lot of sneaky things to gain cube equity, where Annihilus is perhaps the least cube equitous powerful card in the entire game right now, because literally everyone knows what you're doing and literally everyone knows how to play around it. So they only stay in these games where you like play Sentry and Snap, where they're just like, oh yeah, it's cool, I beat that. And so you end up relying on Cersei in the Sentry lane, because in the Void lane, I should say, because then you end up in a world where they're like, well, if they're staying, they can beat this, so I should probably do the thing they're not expecting. And that sort of gives Annihilus a bit of a negative, relatively speaking, cube profile. Relative, again, this is relative to other things that we could be doing, and that seems to be what this deck is keying off of. I think it's a really interesting note here to point out that like Mysterio Mockingbird is just like so clearly a powerful thing that it can subsidize so many of these decks. And I think that's something that probably should be having an eye kept on it, because these are all very different decks and that through line runs through basically all of them. Here's one that it doesn't run through. This is The Prophecy. I believe it's a group effort of like Jimmy Dickens and Butt and Big Baby. A bunch of different people really sort of messed around with this one. And of all the decks on here, this is the one that is the closest to being described as a meme deck that good players play. Where even compared to something like the Combo or whatever, there's an ethos there. There's a thought process where it's like, Blink is actually really good. I get we're doing like kind of a jokey Blink M'Baku thing, but there is an ethos here. Getting a cheap Onslaught is extremely powerful. Like, things are actually happening here. Where with this deck, it feels like it's very much more, I'm going to catch people by surprise and randomly generate stuff and be better at adapting to situations than my opponent is. And I think that there is some appeal for a good player to play decks like this. Like, we talk about how Loki is such a high skill cap deck because of the ways that it is, you know, very different game to game. And I think a lot of high-end players really enjoy that. I think this is a version of that kind of experience, right? You're having a very different experience game to game. You have these helicarrier cards, you have giant collectors, you have varying amounts of just weird discard things happening. You're discarding cards, you're generating cards. A lot of awkward things are coming together in a powerful way. Playing this deck feels a little bit like putting a puzzle together. There's just a little bit of finickiness in it. Enough finickiness that you get to feel really smart when you do something with it. But there, again, just like when we talked about the Combo, there are some baseline like ethos things here happening that are actually very strong, and they should probably be talked about. Proxima Midnight just coming out of your hand is just a strong thing to do in a tempo world. That's a 0/7. Your collectors typically get to like 9 power. That's a strong thing to do as well. And when you look at how this deck actually plays out, what it's looking to do is do, you know, early game big stuff, whether that be a Proxima Midnight, whether that be the Collector, whether that be some sort of, you know, thing you Quinjetted off of an Agent Coulson, and then it's backed up by like the most random stuff you can possibly create. You have a Cersei that can just do whatever. It, like, when I say do whatever, I mean do whatever. You have the Helicarrier cards, which again, that can be literally anything. To me though, this deck really keys on the Collector. This is a deck where your Collector is like a major threat. That is what you want to happen. You have your Collector lane, you have your Cersei lane, and they are two different lanes because your Collector is not going to get better going to 3. And that, I think, is genuinely appealing. Like, we talk a lot about how strong a card like Angela is, or how strong a card like Thena is, and we forget that the Collector can be one of those cards. It just kind of takes more hoops to jump through, and this is what it looks like when you jump through those hoops, right? Like, this is what it looks like if you start with, let's make a great Collector deck. What is the best thing? How do we make Collector as big as possible? You kind of end up at something like this. And I think that's a legitimately strong thing to do. I think it has a lot of appeal to high-level players because it is doing something strong, but doesn't look like it's doing something strong. And I think one dynamic that you'll see a lot at High Infinite is people who are just like, I can't really lose to the deck doing this, can I? Like, there's a lot of, I called it Zubris because it typically applied to like people playing Pool 1 Zoo, who, due to the awful matchmaking, ended up being thrust into the top end of Infinite. And so it gets very hard to play against those players because the deck is actually like, it's almost good, right? Now there's like a real top tier Zoo deck. And so even Pool 1 Zoo, it's like that puts out a lot of points. And so if you had a bad draw and they had a good one, you can lose to it. But people just tend to not retreat into the face of that. They're like, I can't seriously lose to this BS. This is a deck that engenders that reaction. You're going to get people that are like, I'm losing to this? No way I'm losing to this. No way. And then they'll like stay in a situation where they absolutely are losing to this. And I think that is legitimately interesting. Finally, gnome__plays, not stays this time, has managed to strip all the, I guess you'd call it the mid-range out of the Deathbird deck and make it entirely just bottom end and top end now. And I think that's a really interesting way to go about it. Scar is a little bit of an underrated card right now. I see people messing around with him a lot, and I think that's probably the correct thing to do. I do feel like a lot of these decks, part of the reason I wanted to do a video like this is they all hit on something that I think is maybe a little bit underexplored, or could give someone an idea, or generally like plant the seed of an idea and let it germinate. And I think Scar specifically had to be on here, so I'm very glad we got it on here, because he's just so almost good that you kind of expect that at some point he will be great again. Scar, of course, was a Thanos staple for a little bit before that deck got kind of obliterated. And much like Mockingbird, like there's always a market for a cheap, discounted big guy. And this deck is saying, what if we put every cheap, discounted big guy or big woman or big, omniversal force, as the case may be, in the case of death, into the same deck and said, the only thing that matters is points, and I'm going to create as many points as possible. My entire early game is here to facilitate those big guys being cheap, whether that be 1-drops for the sake of Call Obsidian, 1-drops for the sake of Killmonger discounting death, 1-drops for the sake of discounting a Mockingbird. Shout out to Squirrel Girl. It's all in service of the big guys slash girls slash omniversal forces. And I think that is a just straightforward and interesting strategy that I think a lot of people will get a lot of mileage out of, because of all the decks on this list, when you look at this deck, you get it. I think this is the deck that if you're in my audience and you see this, you're like, I know what this can do. I can do this, right? There's no tricks here. It's just, here's some stats. I'm playing a bunch of stats. Here's a bunch of stats. You get one tech card, and it has been used on Rogue in this case. You can feel free to move that card around, right? Like, I almost always would rather have a 2-cost tech card, but I think the 3-1s are so good. But, like, that can be, Nocturne if you want to deal with Limbo gamers. It can be Red Guardian if you want a more general approach. Like, there's just a lot of things you can play in that spot. Shadow King if you want. Like, you got options here. One thing to keep in mind is I found that if you got Scar to 2, it was basically unlosable. And if you got him to 4, your games were like games, right? Getting Scar to 2 is nuts, not just because of what it signifies about your board position, but because a 2-11 is ridiculous. And I think that is a reasonable strategy to take. Like, we took all the mid-range out of the Deathbird. Now it's just cheating energy. All we're doing is cheating energy. And the fact that so many of these energy cheats sort of overlap, right? You have Squirrel Girl, which enables your Call Obsidian, gets Killmonger to discount your death, enables your Mockingbird. just a bunch of different stuff overlaps in this deck in a very fun and enjoyable way. All right, y'all, I hope you enjoyed that look at weird stuff I've lost to this week. I am interested to see the reception to a video like this because it's not necessarily against type for me to cover this kind of stuff. I've done these sort of like weird deck highlights before, but it's sort of against type for it to be like a full video in this way. So please let me know what you think, if you do anything to improve the way in which I covered this, if you do anything differently about it, if you have a good suggestion for a name, if you want the series to continue, things like that. Just let me know in the comments. I still actually read every single one of my comments, much to the detriment of my mental health. Thank you so much for making it through that video. I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.